Those of you who have ever brought a newborn baby home from a hospital know how fragile they seem. Like, who let me out into the wild with this enormously fragile being? When our second child, Benjamin, was born in August of 2021, we had a lot of concerns about bringing him home. Like, would his 2.5-year-old sister accidentally crush him? Would his 2.5-year-old sister crush him on purpose? And other typical second child worries. But then, a few weeks into his young life, another worry came and manifested for us. You see, we lived in Wyoming at the time, and August and September are peak wildfire smoke season. We lived in an old brick house, which in the winter held heat like a boss, and it was incredible. But in late August, when it's 90 and sunny, also held heat like a boss. And we didn't have air conditioning because it's Wyoming and it's winter like 10 months a year there, so lots of homes don't have AC. And normally that's just fine, except when it's 90 degrees and the air is full of smoke, and you have a newborn baby who both has a hard time regulating his own body temperature because newborn babies are still figuring that out, and has little teeny tiny soft lungs, still developing. I remember holding him and sweating because we had closed the windows to keep out the wildfire smoke as best we could. I remember holding him and looking down and thinking, how am I gonna give this world to you? This one that seems to be on fire. How can I pass this world to you without being overcome with guilt and shame and grief? How will you someday survive the unsurvivable? Together, how will we face the unimaginable? How can I do enough to protect you and our world? But when you think a lot about climate change, maybe you, like me, have one of two very natural human reactions. You either become frozen in fear, stuck in a thought loop about the owls that David Attenborough has let you know are no more, about melting polar ice caps, about rising sea levels, about, will New York City even exist in the future? Or you feel like shrugging in apathy, which sometimes moves in a cycle with becoming frozen in fear. Right? You become frozen in fear, but your mind can't sustain that state for too long, and so then you shrug and go about your day because what are you gonna do about climate change? Or maybe it's the combination of those two that is embodied, I think, in it. How many of you are familiar with the emoji that's the melting face? Yes, the melting, which was conveniently released in September 2021. Really embodied that moment in our life and world. Because the truth is that human beings are terrible at doing certain things that would be really helpful to combating climate change, right? We're actually terrible at a couple of things. It's just not how our brain is wired. And Justin Fisher, who is the person who has inspired me to speak to you all today about climate change by purchasing an auction sermon, shared with me, you're like, that's who's to blame. inspired me not to share with you doom and gloom, but instead he shared some episodes with me from a podcast called The Happiness Lab with Dr. Laurie Santos. You're like, that is a turn we were not expecting. But particularly, he shared with me the work of 3 happiness researchers, Jiang Zhao, who goes by JC, Liz Dunn, and Dan Gilbert. And so they share with us about the things that our brains are just not very good at doing. So one thing that human brains are really bad at doing is giving things up or sacrificing. And in fact, right, it's not just that we're bad at sacrificing, it's that, as Jay-Z describes, a primary driver of human behavior is pleasure. A primary driver of human behavior is not doing less for the good of the cause. In fact, that is the opposite of how the human brain is wired, right? We are driven by pleasure. And so if you ask us to give up something, driving, beef, right, all those, right, long hot showers, airplane rides, if you ask us to give up those things without that clear immediate risk, you're going to be pretty disappointed in how humans behave in response to that push to give things up, as I'm sure many of you have been throughout time. Because the corollary thing that we're really bad at is that we're really bad at perceiving threats that do not map neatly onto the kinds of threats that our ancient human ancestors faced. Right? Like if climate change chased us with a big stick, we would be a lot more afraid of it than we currently are. Because our human brain is wired to be afraid of immediate threats. That is what helped us make it this far. But that same brain that has brought us this far does not do a very good job at perceiving risk or threat from something that is nebulous, something that doesn't have a face, and something whose consequences are, though ever closer, still sort of vague and in a future that we can't really see. I think, right, like we are psychologically incapable of staying afraid for a long time of something that isn't about to kill us right here, right now. So if you feel yourself slipping into freezing or slipping into shrugging or apathy, you're not somehow a weak person who doesn't care about the earth. You are a human being with a human brain that was designed to like hunt mastodons and stuff, and not to face the enormous, multi-headed, terrifying hydra of a changing climate. So how do we face it then? Since climate change will probably not be picking up a stick and chasing us through the woods anytime soon, how do we avoid one of those 2 well-worn pathways for so many of us, which are freezing with fear in a terrifying thought loop, or shrugging and going about our day because we feel powerless as an individual? And I will say that this avoiding one of those 2 sort of well-worn loops of thought or plans of inaction is particularly difficult for those of us who are either living lives that are completely overwhelmed already or who face other existential threats in our current environment. Right? Existential threats that feel a lot more like somebody chasing us through the woods with a big stick than climate change does. Right? For people who live in Black and brown bodies and face police violence, for LGBTQ people, and particularly our trans and non-binary siblings who are wondering if their existence is going to be legislated against constantly, for women who are terrified about, and other people with uteruses, terrified about their reproductive rights. All of that, I don't know about you, but for me, all of that feels a lot more like somebody is chasing me with a stick. It feels like an immediate and present threat. So how do we integrate that reality with the truth that our changing climate requires significant action on the part of not just any individual, but of all people? And how do we do it without reverting to what I think of as sort of ecological puritanism, that blames everything on individual weakness and individual behavior, and that proclaims that there is one right way to save the earth, and if you're not doing it, you're evil, right? It's the sort of the I'm not doing, which we can perpetuate on ourselves too. Sometimes we do the you're not doing enough, where we wag our finger at other people. But another form of getting frozen is the thought loop of I'm not doing enough, which is equally unhelpful. To think to yourself, I'm not doing enough all the time. Because a little bit, right, a little dash of I'm not doing enough might motivate you, but a constant loop, a constant internal narrative that I'm not doing enough, I'm not doing enough, I'm not doing enough, will not actually motivate you to do more. Perhaps some of you are intimate with this thought loop and the reality that it has not led you to personally solve climate change. So what do we do? Not what do we do, but how do we do it? How do we reframe this freight train without brakes that Amanda talked about into a world that feels livable and worth saving? I want to share a passage from a work called Pleasure Activism by the writer and theorist Adrienne Marie Brown. A central aspect of pleasure activism is tapping into the natural abundance that exists within and between us, between our species and this planet. Pleasure is not one of the spoils of capitalism. It is what our bodies, our human systems, are structured for. Pleasure is aliveness and awakening, the gratitude and humility, the joy and celebration of being miraculous. So rather than encouraging moderation over and over, she continues, I want to ask you to relinquish your longing for excess and stay mindful of your relationship to enough. How much sex would be enough? How high would be high enough? How much love would feel like enough? Can you imagine being healed enough, happy enough, connected enough, having enough space in your life to actually live it? Can you imagine being free enough? What a beautiful meditation on enough, right? That we don't need to shout for moderation over and over again, but rather to reframe it as healing our relationship with excess. I think about this core question, can you imagine being and having enough? Because the two are linked. And they're two core essential teachings of Unitarian Universalism, right? One is that we are each of us worthy in our fullness right now, right here, as you are. Whatever terrible thought loop was going on in your head when you came in the door this morning, you're enough, right here, right now. And that this experience of inherent worth leads us not toward rugged individualism, but instead toward building a world that reflects the truth of each person's dignity. I am enough, you are enough, we are enough. And it is possible to have enough, which is another core teaching of Unitarian Universalism, particularly from our Universalist heritage, which is that abundance is possible. Not through magical thinking or the prosperity gospel or like manifesting things, right? That's not the sort of like religious abundance that I'm talking about. I'm talking about that abundance is possible for us through our willingness to share in community. Together, we have enough. We are enough. We have enough. And the truth is that not every individual has enough right now. And several individuals have too much. But together, it is possible for us to have enough. What would an approach to climate change look like that's centered on the core truth that we are, each of us, together and individually, enough, and that it's possible for us to have enough, and that, in fact, strengthening our ability to understand enough is the core of our work on climate change. Not education, not browbeating, not even legislative advocacy, but a transformation of our relationship to what it means to be and have enough. What if that was the center of our work? I imagine that it might transform it in a few ways. The first is that it might encourage us to release our perfectionism. Some of those happiness researchers in the podcast that Justin shared, talked about how we sometimes think that because we haven't done one thing for the climate, we might as well just eat 10 cheeseburgers in our monster truck. Maybe you have an electric monster truck, in which case please bring it to the fellowship next week. But that there is no one right way to undo what has been done, right? There's no one thing, there's no right way, there is no right approach, there is no perfect way to undo climate change. And that this release of perfectionism is also helpful with the tool that he's like the godfather of happiness psychology, Dan Gilbert, which what a title. That Dan Gilbert talks about, that the most effective tool that you and I as individuals have to combat climate change is the ballot. That the most significant action an individual person can take when you look at the data, the most impact you, an individual, can have, is to add your vote to a mass movement to elect candidates who will put forward legislation and policy that will move us forward on climate. But sometimes we get caught up in electoral perfectionism, and we cannot figure out how to vote for people who we do not actually like. But when we release perfectionism, we can, as I do, frame voting not as an end-all, be-all, but as harm reduction. As looking at our world as it is and recognizing that great harm is being done, and that we can do less harm without needing to be perfect. A second thing that transforming this relationship to enough might do is that it might help us release our fear, that is that nebulous fear that has nowhere to sort of go, and instead Find the people with sticks who are, in fact, chasing us down in the woods about climate change. That's one of the reasons that Greta Thunberg has been so successful, is that she helped us see that there were, in fact, bad actors. There were people who wished us ill through their corporate greed, and that we could direct our anger at them. Indeed, Adrienne Marie Brown writes about this, that part of the reason so few of us have a healthy relationship with pleasure is because a small minority of our species hoards the excess of resources, creating a false scarcity and then trying to sell us back our own joy.
Say that again.
Okay. Part of the reason so few of us have a healthy relationship with pleasure is because a small minority of our species hoards the excess of resources, creating a false scarcity, and then they try to sell us back our own joy. So many of the things that are damaging our climate, right? Things like our ability to ship whatever tchotchke we want at the push of a button to our houses, fast fashion, which if you do not know about the terrifying monster that is fast fashion and what it has done to our earth, I will gladly tell you about it. I will buy you a sandwich so that you don't have to hear about it on an empty stomach. But that fast fashion is an example, right? The fact that clothes are cheaper, not in price, but in quality than ever, and more harmful for our environment than ever. Right? They are selling us back our own joy, saying, look at this hellscape we've created for you. Do you want a new pair of jeans? But the truth is that people who individually purchase that pair of jeans are not the person with the stick chasing us. But there are entities, people profiting off of that enormously, and corporations creating that sort of environmental degradation who are deserving of our ire. So we can release perfectionism when we transform our relationship to enough. We can release our fear and instead find the people who deserve our outrage if we transform our relationship to enough so that they cannot sell us back our joy in the form of new clothes or new toys or new whatevers. And the final thing that transforming our relationship to enough might do is that it might make doing good, doing justice, building the world we dream about, a pleasurable experience. Right? That doing the right thing, and this is the whole thesis of so much of the work of those happiness researchers who work adjacent to climate research, want us to know, is that we can make transforming our world a pleasurable experience. Not focusing on giving up, but a focus on doing the things that make us feel like we have enough and are enough. And that at the same time promote the community and environment we want to build. Things like bikeable, walkable, and mass transit-friendly cities. Those things are not just good for the environment, they're good for us. They're good for our bodies, they're good for our social relationships. They're good for those who have the least access, who are using and relying on public transit right now. And that we would honestly, truthfully, if we pitched a bikeable, walkable city not as good for the environment, not as giving up driving, but as adding something of value, but of making our lives better, we would have more success with these silly human brains of ours, which are terrible at sacrifice and great at feeling good. We can refuse to submit to the idea that it's a zero-sum game, and that in order to save the earth, you have to give up what you like and I have to give up what I like, and if we all just sacrificed a little more, then somehow corporate greed would be undone. It won't. But that if we truly hone in on what makes us feel pleasure, not the kind of pleasure that has been sold back to us by corporations, but genuine human connection, things that make us feel good in our bodies, things that make us feel connected to other people, things that make us feel good about the communities we live in, if we really did those things, that would be good for the earth. So how do we survive the unsurvivable? How do we face the unimaginable? And perhaps the question that keeps me and many, many of you up at night the most: how do I give this world such as it is to my children without being overcome by guilt, by shame, and by grief? I will begin with enough, and that will be enough. May it be so. Amen.